there's just so much coming out slowly, and you can tell the political people are running for cover.
What exactly has been going on to back up what you just were saying?
What I think happened is there are a bunch of unseen people who surround our political leader who have been influencing him. And so you can see from Trudeau, who started off sounding young and inspirational, he was surrounded by people who essentially wanted to reorganize how our society looked in terms of meeting the boxes of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so decided to kind of socially engineer departments in the federal government. The biggest target, and I wrote an article on this, I think that's interesting, was the Department of National Defense, because his liberal radicals saw it as the most toxic male institution. Lieutenant General Stephen Whalen, who's my client, and he, Vance, and I all served in the past together. One of the reasons why he's fought so hard against the government is he said this to me numerous times. He goes, fuck, if they can do this to me at the chief of military personnel, CMP, third highest in the country, imagine what they could do to a corporal.
Folks, I'm sitting down again with Philip Millar. Philip was last on the show in December of 2023, episode 191. If you want to go reference it, I'll put it in the description. We had a really interesting chat. And Phil, I haven't told you this, but on numerous occasions, I had people reach out to me and be like, dude, that was the best podcast you've ever done. Even on LinkedIn, some guy was like, I had to listen to this twice. This was incredible. It's not reflective in the views. So if you want to go back and listen to know where we're coming from, I think it'd be really important, because Phil, a lot of the things you said and a lot of things we talked about on that show have come true. So you're kind of like an oracle. You talked about James Topp because you're representing him during his lawsuit. You were also representing troops that were unjustly kicked out of the Canadian Armed Forces. And we didn't have all the information that we have now with respects to the ATIP requests that have shown all the emails and documentation showing that Canadian Armed Forces clearly knew that their shots were not safe and effective, that they knew that it was going to be an unlawful order, that they knew it was going to be against human rights. And now we also have the independent review that said, yes, indeed, this was an infringement on human rights. So we've got a lot to go over. And you've got even more to add onto the pile in terms of what's going on in the forces and what seems like rampant corruption. So, Phil, I'll leave it to you to get started with your topic of the day. And I know you just moved too, which is big news as well for you. So you're a busy man, and let's just get right into it. Phil, what's the topic of the day, and where are we going to start today?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on, Ed. To address your point, my goal in leading the infantry and when I became a lawyer was to advocate for first responders and citizens who are getting pushed around by bullies. But what I found where I've evolved recently is I want to provide a space where we can have a dialogue on complex issues where it's not just one ideology against the other ideology talking past each other. And it's a tough road to travel, because when I was advocating for those veterans who are getting kicked out, we just ran into this wall at the federal court where they said they can redress. And that was a very sad thing for me, because I'm used to winning, and I wasn't able to keep those soldiers in the military because of the way the federal government worked, and because of the way the redress system worked, and because of what Trudeau was doing with the chief of defense staff, right? And now it's very clear, as you've probably talked about on your show, that they knew it was an illegal order. Wayne Eyre was briefed by his staff not to enforce the mandate, and he was told directly by the Prime Minister's office to do it anyhow. And that's kind of what we're dealing with in our country right now, is our military is being used as a social policy instrument from a liberal government that wants to kind of take the most masculine institution and essentially castrate it of any kind of what they call toxic masculinity, which we might call necessary lethality. And they've destroyed hundreds of good people's lives, men, women, soldiers, sailors, airmen, airwomen. But I think the tide is starting to turn. But we're getting the political movement is getting there, but there's just so much coming out slowly, and you can tell the political people are running for cover because they don't want, the Lieutenant General Whelan case was just growing, I think, when we talked, but that's that he suffered that. Do you want to go back over that case again?
Yeah, let's get into for anybody that kind of is like Well, what do you mean the ideology? Let's touch on that. What was happening in the federal Liberal Party over really the last decade or so? I think it goes back a little bit further, but let's for brevity's sake keep it to the last like Trudeau era, Trudeau 2.0 era. What exactly has been going on to back up what you just were saying, like the prime minister is ordering the CDS, which, from my understanding, according to the way our government is set up, is a big no-no? Because I've covered this. Actually, my best video was, did we just experience a soft coup d'etat or a silent coup d'etat? Because you can't have the prime minister ordering the CDS. The CDS swears allegiance to the king or the queen, whenever it was at that time, and the prime minister just acts at the pleasure of essentially the government, if I understand correctly. So if we can go back there, explain a little bit what's going on at that federal level and ideologically, and then why is Whalen or General Whalen's case so important, and tie all this into Hey there, Hard to Kill listeners. Today's episode is brought to you by Natesto. Did you know that only 5% of men get treated for low testosterone? Low testosterone is a serious health concern that is rarely discussed, especially in the veteran community. Toxic exposure, mild traumatic brain injuries, and terrible sleep habits can all contribute to a rock bottom total T-score. I want to help improve the health and fitness of the veteran community, and that's why I've partnered with Natesto. Talk to your doctor today and see if Natesto is the right solution for you. My new book, Harden to Fuck Up, was written as a guide for anybody that follows the podcast and wants to put together all the things that they've learned from amazing guests. It is Dallas Alexander approved. Tim Jensen from Grunstyle wrote the foreword. And if you want to lose weight, you want to get a grip of your health, your waistline, and your mental health this year, I strongly recommend going to Amazon and getting your ebook, audiobook, or paperback copy immediately. Would love to hear a review, and train hard, fight easy. Let's get back to the episode.
So there's a lot. I have a poli-sci major, but it's dated. But essentially, what I think happened is, the cadre that surrounded Biden and the Kamala Harris leadership. Yeah. There are a bunch of unseen people who surround our political leader who have been influencing him. And so you can see from Trudeau, who started off sounding young and inspirational, he was surrounded by people who essentially wanted to reorganize how our society looked in terms of meeting the boxes of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so decided to kind of socially engineer departments in the federal government. The biggest target, and I wrote an article on this, I think that's interesting, was the Department of National Defense, because his liberal radicals saw it as the most toxic male institution because of this legacy of improper sexual assault investigations. And anybody who's been in the military knows that the military isn't perfect, and they did not investigate some things properly when it came to sexual assault in the military. But that doesn't mean that the whole institution has to be, castrated. And what happened, though, is it became a very useful tool politically, that if an allegation came up, to publicly defenestrate a general, because they were obvious, right? And what Lieutenant General Stephen Whalen, who's my client, and Vance and I all served in the past together, one of the reasons why he's fought so hard against the government is he said this to me numerous times. He goes, fuck, if they can do this to me at the chief of military personnel, CMP, third highest in the country, imagine what they could do to a corporal if an allegation comes up. And it gives me tingles to think about it, because, it was cool, but they wanted to get media headlines. And it looks like the military was deliberately leaking these stories to certain reporters to make it look like the Liberal government was taking a hard line against these generals. And when you look at every general who was fired, and there hasn't been one successful prosecution. Sorry. 4 or 5 generals. So we took 4 or 5 absolute warfighters who saw combat, and underneath them was Lieutenant General Jenny Kerrigan, who was moving up the ranks, and she got put into that standards and protocol office, whose job was almost like a Stalinistic job to report. Yeah, commissar. And so Lieutenant General Whelan, the article explains that when the military tried to fix the problem, they started paying people on allegations alone. So the class actions, all you have to do is say something happened to me, and you would get a paycheck. There would be no investigation. But in some cases, it would be referred to the military police. The military police knew that they had to go ahead. In Whelan's case, it was a historic allegation by somebody who was desperate for money, getting released, who had been his friend up until the time he was released. And then all of a sudden this allegation comes in, it's nonsense. And it looks like many military police who came onto it decided they didn't want to go ahead with it, but kept getting replaced by somebody who would push ahead with it. And they wanted to get their pound of flesh. And he's like, I am not bowing down to you. You guys, are leaking this to the press. General Whalen was lying to him when he was talking to him about it. So we go ahead.
Can I just, but why? Is it just what you said? What did Whalen represent, or what did he stand in the way of that required him to be removed?
I think it was a simple calculus that the more generals they could sacrifice on the altar of public opinion made them look like they were doing something, as opposed to kind of digging in and seeing what the real problem is. What I had said from the beginning is take any organization a similar size to the Canadian Armed Forces and then look if the instances of sexual assault are higher or lower. Nobody's ever done that. What's happened is when you have an organization of 100,000 people, you're going to have issues, but not less than Enron or a giant mining company. So that's what we should be basing it. But what happened is it just became too easy of a target in the media in Ottawa and with the Liberal government to say, look at us being so pro-female, we're hammering these evil males who are generals, right? And so they just got fired before due process could happen. And in this particular case, they wanted him to get fired and plead guilty, and they could just check, another thing done. When we insisted on going ahead with the court-martial, we subpoenaed the Chief of Defense Staff and the Vice Chief of Defense Staff because the complainant was calling them directly while the investigation was going on. We got the records that said that they were having conversations, the VCDS and the CDS, with the person who is putting the complaint in, which goes against all due process. They're his chain of command. So I was successful at having them subpoenaed. They were going to testify at the court-martial. So we go into the court-martial, and on the day of the court-martial, they're like, we'll withdraw. And they were just 2 129s for your audience. So this is the highest general ever court-martialed, charged with 2 counts of 129.
That's conduct unbecoming of an officer.
Yeah. Like the most lowest level charge ever, right? If you're late for parade,
that's the give me like charge. Like you got a list of charges and it's like 129. Why not?
So it's a catch-all charge, and essentially saying he improperly flirted with a lower rank who wasn't under his chain of command, and then she had made some bogus allegations that she didn't get the PR she wanted because she wouldn't sleep with him, and that it turned out not to be true. They run the court-martial. She testifies, absolutely falls apart. Before I can cross-examine, I spent like 2 weeks straight ready to destroy this woman. We come in the next day. I'm about to cross-examine her, and the prosecutor runs in and goes, "Can I talk to you?" And this is after he had been telling Whalen to plea the whole time. He goes, "If you just plea, we won't put these emails in the public record. You won't be embarrassed." And we refused to plea. And before I could cross-examine, he goes, "We got to withdraw the charges." I'm like, "Why?" He goes, "Yeah." And I had a witness see him. He was on the phone in his car. We were late in the court-martial waiting for him to come in. And one of my team saw him on the phone in a heated discussion. And it was a Monday morning, which I guarantee you that's somebody from the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council's office. They're talking about how they're going to damage control this. He runs in and says, "We're withdrawing it." And so court-martial ends. Never get to cross-examine her. Steve never gets to tell the story. And most importantly, the Chief of Defense Staff and the VCDS are freed from going under oath, answering it.
That's what they were protecting.
That's exactly what it was, right?
They know damn well that was it Air at the time, or how did
Air was the CDS? Yeah.
I can't stand man. I can't stand that guy, man.
No, I know, and he's such a fake tough guy. But what's interesting from a scheming perspective is when we started the court-martial, there was this civilian E3 who sat right behind our counsel desk and was like looking at our screens. And so I had a troop there that was sympathetic to our cause. I had them sit behind and started recording the screen. And that person was writing notes for Jenny Kerrigan's office during the court-martial right behind our screen. But he watched and saw that whenever something positive was said about Whalen, no notes were taken. But anytime there was the sentence of a hint that he did something wrong, would write down those notes. she realized somebody was watching her computer. In the end, she kept moving back until her back was against the wall at the end, so she couldn't see our screen. So I enjoyed that element. But
Oh my God.
all of these generals get fired. Who then becomes nominated for Chief of Defense Staff? Jenny Kerrigan. Interesting enough. But days after the court-martial was withdrawn, the VCDS hits Whalen with an administrative review saying they want to 5F release him as unsuitable for further service, which is mind-blowing. And to any of our listeners who know what that is, that's essentially close to a discreditable conduct. You don't get your severance benefits. But this was a 12 to 14-year-old allegation that was not substantiated. It was withdrawn. It wasn't like a not guilty on a technicality. And they used the information from a flawed military police investigation to say, we found on the balance of probabilities that you're a bad person and you can't stay in the forces anymore.
But not only just not stay in the forces, discredit you on the way out.
Yes.
That is
Go ahead. Sorry, you said it when we were talking before. You might as well say it. What does your listener and everybody know happened? Why did they do that?
Well, I mean, this is because they've got egg on their face. They feel like, man, how do we save face here? We need to hammer this guy and chuck him. And then the headlines are, Whalen or General leaves in disgrace. So then it's kind of the implication is like, well, he was guilty anyways.
Yeah,
so
it's retribution, but they're using the administrative system to 5F release somebody when they had a failed prosecution. And the punishment, if you get a 5F, you lose severance. And at his level, that's almost $200,000. Yeah. Like if he gets convicted of a 129, what do you get, $1,000 fine?
If that, yeah.
Right? So see how they're using the system. So we're bringing an injunction in the federal court. It's probably in the papers right now, asking the federal court to stop his 5F release until we can finish the lawsuit, because we sued the government for $10 million, which I know upsets some people because it seems a lot, but we actually needed to make a splash to hold him accountable for destroying his career and have them stop that. So,
well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the education I'm getting over the last 3-4 years is that, especially here in Canada, I think we're at, I call it the era of accountability, because I see it happening in the US. Mm-hmm. And you've been talking about it too on your LinkedIn page. The fact that we haven't had large scale lawsuits against the government that have made waves, especially from the military, because we've always been rule followers. We don't sue the military. We don't sue the chain of command. That's not what we do. I mean, and how many lawyers are actually capable of doing what you do? There's like a handful, right? In Canada, there's not many, because it's just never really been a thing. But now, like, the onions are being peeled, and the decades and decades of mistreatment and unlawful behavior is sickening. And it seems like the chain of command has known this for so long, and they just figured with impunity they'll be able to treat their troops like garbage, not realizing that we have the internet, we can communicate with each other, we can share notes, and we can actually go out and hire people like yourself to defend troops and their rights. And like, not just troops, but generals. And, to touch on another point too, like, from what I understand, 20% of the general staff or the GOFO staff were under investigation at some point in the Canadian Armed Forces, which to me says there needs to be an inquiry on that in and of itself, because that tells me that there's some sort of infiltration and ideological capture that deserves to be completely burned out of our system, because it's almost like an insurgency. 20%? That's freaking insane.
But what I've commented on before is nobody is talking about this in Ottawa. When you incentivize an allegation, if you have 1,000 men, there'll be a small percentage of them that are very bad, violent men, right? There'll be some that go across boundaries, and there'll be some that like slap, you know what I mean? Like, there's just a percentage of 1,000 people who are good to evil. If you have 1,000 women, you're going to have a certain percentage who will cheat on their taxes, certain percentage who will lie about their weight, and a certain percentage who will lie to get $100,000 to $150,000 tax-free check, right? And so we have to look at it when the military incentivizes allegations for tax-free dollars. We have to ensure there's still due process, but there was no due process because everybody said, hammer these people. And so many innocent men's lives were ruined because of these incentivized allegations. None of them have been successful. But think of this, Dave. If I wanted to undermine Canada's national security architecture, and I have a hardcore general that I want to get rid of, like Vance was going to go to NATO command, and they didn't want our enemies didn't want Vance to go to NATO command after he was CDS.
Oh.
If I wanted to destabilize Canada's security architecture, what would be the easiest way to do that? Pay somebody to make an allegation against a general, because our system would just fire them. And so it takes 30 years, 25 million to 50 million to train a general to that level. And if you look at this, we just lost 5 of them without one conviction, right? So think of it like if I'm China or Russia and I want to destabilize a country, if a country will destroy its generals on an allegation alone, all I have to do is pay somebody to make an allegation. It's far cheaper than deep espionage.
Yeah, that's a bargain basement regime overthrow. Because I don't know if you can speak to this in any more depth, but I mean, it's public knowledge. There's clearly people in government that have ties to either the CCP, Iran, foreign entities.
China, India.
But I don't hear anything more about that major threat to our democracy. So how can any decision that's being made, in my opinion, every decision that's made by can you even call it the federal government right now? Because I guess they're technically in power, even though they're doing things behind closed doors, Parliament's closed. Like, are the decisions being made in the best interest of Canada? And if we just look at the actual decisions that have been made over the last 10 years, I could make the argument that these decisions weren't in the best interest of Canada. They're in the interest of something else. And if that's the case, we're in dangerous territory. And what do you think about that? Is that kind of why we went down this path, or is there something more to it?
Kind of creeps up on organizations, and our generals haven't been known for standing up in the face of government, right? I've been calling on some of these retired generals who enjoy the favor of the populace, like Hillier, or some of them, to stand up and say something controversial about how the government is ruining it, right? And they're shying away from it, which disappoints me. But Mike Rouleau, that guy who is a VCDS, Jody Thomas was the Prime Minister's right-hand woman for kind of addressing these generals and taking them out. Mike Rouleau wrote a letter to her because she said, we want to make public any investigation, not a charge, any investigation against a senior officer. And he wrote a beautiful handwritten letter to her saying, this is a complete breach of due process, breach of law, breach of that. I'm asking everybody to resist this. And so they didn't actually go ahead with that policy of D&D publicly releasing the names. In the end, it looks like they were leaked. But Rouleau was first forced out 3 months later. So think of it. Anybody who sticks their neck out knows it's career suicide. And so nobody will stick their neck out. And this is what happens to our society when the senior people become compliant and obedient in order to get promoted. That's why I kind of like what Trump is doing, is throwing in a bit of some usurpers who aren't part of the system. It's very hard to fix the system if you've just been a member of it for 30 years. But in Whalen's case now, what is really inspiring is that there are some people coming out of the woodwork and willing to kind of now stand up and be a witness, especially in this case, and say a 5F release in this case. We have some senior generals retired now who are saying they have never seen a 5F release ever in a case like General Whelan's. Wow. And it looks like the clearest incident of retribution ever. So I think people are starting to get some courage, but it's kind of like that Spartacus. Somebody has to stand up and be the first one. Yeah.
Spartacus.
So, and then everybody can get, and then everybody pretends to be brave. Who's, the last 20% pretend they're brave, but really they were waiting for everybody else to stand up.
Precisely. I can't reiterate that point enough. Apparently, there's only about 4% of any population that really stand up for the values and virtues of a society when the chips are down. And it's because most people are just absolutely petrified of breaking away from the groupthink, because it could theoretically mean death. So it is that dangerous to ideologically kind of align yourself with something else, or even just morally align yourself with something that is usually perceived as right and virtuous. And I can't reconcile with a lot of people when, especially during that COVID era, it just exposed so many people's tendency towards authoritarianism, and especially here in Canada, because we don't have a culture of rebellion from what I can see. Like the Americans are rebellious because their country was built off rebellion. So our culture here doesn't seem to really embrace counterculture. And to touch on what you were talking about, bringing in outsiders, Hegseth during his confirmation hearing, he's like, Trump wanted somebody with dirt on his boots.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of ad hominem attacks, oh, he's a drinker. He has neo-Nazi tattoos. It's like, okay, what about like what he's actually done and what he's accomplished? Like he was boots on the ground in the blood and guts. And from my perspective, and a lot of us veterans like yourself, I think we're just finally seeing the 20 years of warfare bearing the fruit that I was hoping would come. And that's in the form of, we're actually taking the leadership roles that we absolutely should be stepping into. And to echo your point with like General Hillier, yeah, I see him on Twitter. He stands up for, like anti-Hamas, like protests and stuff like that. That's all fine and dandy. But when the chips were down, when it was COVID season, when people were losing their jobs, none of them stood up. And I lost total respect for that whole group of individuals, because they could have changed the tide, but they chose not to. So with that being said, and speaking about kind of like the new tide that's turned now towards more of an era of accountability. You did some posts on LinkedIn, namely like, should we invite, or should we allow those that are anti-Trumpers from the States up to Canada? But it's kind of tongue in cheek, but I like the message. We're kind of creating a bifurcation here in our country, because we're still, I think, in that mindset of we need to take everybody's money and redistribute to the people that need it most. Whereas the Americans, like you said, Trump surrounded himself with all the billionaires, the people that make shit. What do we do here? That's my biggest contention, is that what do we actually do here in Canada? Because I don't feel comfortable growing an empire here if I know that I'm just going to be hamstrung compared to my competition, who's literally like an hour across the border and can compete with lower taxes, more access to resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know where to go from here. I'm only one guy. I'm curious to know what you think about that and like how we move forward from there.
The beauty of the military, especially in the ranks, I think, is that we celebrated exceptionalism, right? Like the guys who are going on the Ranger course to Pathfinder, generally those people earned it, right? And our country now in Canada is like anti-exceptionalism, right? It's like, no, average is better. And you're right. Like we have an empire, we have to defend what we have so that we can grow and lift everybody's up. The reason why I wrote that article is I just saw CTV and all these news agencies making it look like people are leaving the States to come to Canada. And I'm like, look, in terms of migration, I want people who make things in my country, not people who just cancel people. If we take all of the cancel culture people and move them into Canada, and all of us entrepreneurs and move them to the States, this country dies. So, but how do we encourage exceptional people to stay here when you can't voice an opinion on anything without getting canceled, where you're torn down if you're successful, where you have to be polite and, accept people protesting on our streets, criticizing our country? Like we vilified the people who want to make things. And, I think me and a lot of my friends, if there was an opportunity to leave, we'd almost consider it, because you don't feel welcome, doing the right thing here. But I don't think that's what most Canadians feel. I think that's what the media echo chambers are putting out there. And I think when our election comes, we're going to see something similar to what happened in the States, is that the average citizen cares about their school values, crime, and other things. So hopefully we see a turn in the politics, but I'm worried for Canada. And the only reason why we haven't had anything happen in Canada, like what happened with the Secret Service and the assassination attempt or the fires, is Canadian military hasn't done anything recently. But the first big deployment we do, we could see some serious casualties because of, how weak we've become. You can't take a safe space card into Ukraine or into China. Like, these people we're trying to hire, it just doesn't work. We need, and we have this giant recruiting shortage, and nobody is smart enough in Ottawa to understand that maybe we need to look gung-ho to get people to join the military, and not like Starbucks baristas. But
yeah, that's a major point of contention, I guess, between me and like, you know, the individuals that would rather see a military that's, you know, equitable. This whole conversation between equity and equality, it needs to be resolved. And, you know, I saw it when I was back in university, way back when I was just doing my bachelor's, but also when I came back. So I came back from Afghanistan in 2011. I started doing my master's in 2012 or 2013. So I'm still kind of not fully home yet. And I'm trying to get back into just the regular thick of things. I'm working full time. I've got a kid. I've, you know, started going back to school. So I'm trying to be normal. And the conversation I'm hearing is like, hey, what are your pronouns? And I thought everybody was joking. I was like, well, what? But I also, you know, heard a term, equity. And now for me, equity was financial. And then I wasn't quite tracking. I was a bit dumb. I was still kind of infantry dumb. I was like, what are we talking about equity? It's like, oh, it's when you help people that are less fortunate get a leg up. And I was like, well, that's a good thing. But then I started realizing, based on these courses I was taking, hey, wait, there's a weird narrative going on here. And I don't know how it ended up getting translated into the military. And is it from what you were just talking about, this idea that we have to attack the institution that has the like biggest balls, let's say, to essentially castrate the nation, so that we end up with a bunch of individuals that A, don't want to be there, so the war fighters get out, and then B, you end up with an ineffective military, so the country is just kind of useless as a whole. Because essentially, if you don't have a military, you don't really have any way to project power nor protect your own shit. So am I just really making this too basic of an evaluation, or is there kind of merit to it? Because I think that conversation between equity and equality is kind of the root of where we got stuck, because we don't appreciate those that do really well. And especially in the military, we just want people that kind of are wishy-washy. Is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Like, I think what happened is a lot of these liberal advisors to the leaders, like, have, you know, they're pampered elites who think that they've never seen adversity. So they don't really see the utility of a military other than to signal how progressive we are. And they had too much influence, and it was just so obvious. It was a victory for them to say, hey, look, if we can tell them, and our system is top down, the PM tells them what to do. So if we can put tampons in all the male washrooms on the bases, you know, look at what we're doing for trans. Like, no, but for them, they think it's a giant victory for the trans cause, because they're using this institution, even though it doesn't make sense, even though people quit because of it, right? Your equity, I'm reminded of this example I had in a book once, because we all have a lens, like, and I've hired the wrong people because I thought they were part of my tribe, and I've missed good candidates because I missed something in it. So when they're selecting for the best violinists in Europe and Austria, I had occasion to work with the top school over there. What they do now is they put a screen between the violinist and the audience. And it's amazing that some of the people who were considered the top violinists weren't actually rated as high, because if you see them, you assume they're better, right? But I like that type of assessment, is select people with a screen there, not based on these identity characteristics, just based on, are they amazing? And we've moved in the opposite direction of that. Now you're getting hired based on what boxes you're checking on an application, and it completely destabilizes your organization. The military is the biggest canary, I think, in Canada to show what that damage is, but it exists in every federal government. And I just have no idea where we're going. And I think, you know, Trudeau, in relation to what's going on with these tariffs and Trump, like, what I wrote an article on it when Trump won. So if you're a smart strategist, it's our biggest partner, it's the most powerful nation in the world, Trump wins. The next stage, you go behind a podium and say the US has problems because it didn't elect a female. Like, do you kick? Who does that? But he did that, right? And so what does that do for something like Trump? He's like, I'm gonna hammer that guy, right? And people can get angry at the Americans all they like, but our leaders have to be strategically nuanced, right? As opposed to coming out and say, congratulations, Donald Trump, on your victory. He's clearly representing something in your country that's meaningful, and we are going to work with our top ally to make sure the borders are secure and we restrict the movement of fentanyl and opiates. There's no tariffs. if you say that. Instead, we got this condescending fuckface who gets up on a podium and starts to lecture the most powerful country in the world. Like, you can only do that so long in your like little liberal parties and think there's no consequence, but he's going to leave and we're going to have the consequence of this in our nation. And everybody is like clutching their pearls saying, how dare the US do that? And I'm like, the biggest dog does what the biggest dog wants. We have to fucking work with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the best analogy that I have right now in my life is my son and my daughter who fight like cats and dogs. And my daughter, like we're an Irish family too, right? So there's that mischievous side. So she's way smaller than my son. He's 8, she's 5.
Yeah.
But she still goes and pokes him, like literally and emotionally, right? She knows she's getting smashed. So, but it's like Trudeau didn't understand that lesson. Yeah, you're right. He just went out on an international stage and basically poked the bear. And
he virtue signaled.
Yeah, he virtue signaled because that's all he knows. And then he's surprised when the bear comes back and mauls him. And it's just like, dude, it's just, we live in this weird, bizarro world. But I mean, do you think things are changing? And I'd also like to know too, do you think as the tide changes, because obviously we're intrinsically connected to the United States and their culture and like their trends. We're just always like maybe a year or two behind, it seems, with everything because they're the like the big dog, and then we just follow suit. So I'm going to predict a conservative landslide victory, like every cycle has predicted in the past here in this country. So let's assume new conservative government. Do they reverse course, and do they do kind of what the like MAGA and MAHA movements are doing, and they just burn out all the individuals and like ideologues, get them out of the public service? Like, do they clean house kind of American style, or do you think it's just going to be status quo and they're going to just keep on perpetuating things but go out and say, yeah, we're making changes, but ultimately like the machine still remains the machine?
I would love if they could. I was at a conservative fundraiser giving some advice to Pierre. And this is where, and I'd written an article like, why isn't he on the Jordan Peterson podcast? He went on 2.5 weeks later after I did that. But what I sensed from his advisors was, it's our battle to lose. We just have to not screw up. Trudeau is losing it so badly. So I'm like, so they want to take a risk. And I'm like, you guys have to create a movement. People are hungry. And they're like, no, Trudeau's just going to lose it. So we just have to not screw up. And I'm like, no, there is a movement there that people want to get behind. And if they had, then this tariff thing the Conservatives would have had more momentum behind it. Like, I think Pierre should go on Rogan. Rogan's talked about how much he loves Pierre all the time. But they won't put him on Rogan because they're worried about backlash. And I'm like, I don't think you're going to be as powerful as you could be if you're scared at this moment. Like, Pierre should go sit on Rogan with an apple. He should chomp an apple with Rogan for a comedy set.
Break out the new guns that he's been working on,
and chomp that because Rogan will play that clip, and then he should say, "Look, we are a proud, strong country. We will work with America." Right? I understand what Trump is doing. It's because Trudeau is an ass clown. Right? When we get into power, it's going to be different. Right? But think of like and then of course all the Toronto Star reporters would have a breakdown and need to go see their therapist. But the humans of Canada would get behind him.
You're absolutely right, and you hit the nail on the head. That is a very Canadian approach. Oh, we don't want to rock the boat. We're already doing okay, dude. That's what has gotten us into this state where we don't have, in my opinion, Canada doesn't have a vision. It doesn't even have a culture because nobody's willing to take a fucking stand.
Yeah,
where's that line in the sand? I don't know. Like, somebody asked me like, what is a Canadian? Like, what's Canadian culture? The best I can come up with is like hockey, maybe Tim Hortons, and we like beating the shit out of Germans in a trench like every now and then. Is that it? Is that how we define ourselves? Because even at that, I wouldn't say that that's all Canadians by any stretch of the imagination. Like, what's our value system? What do we stand up for? Americans, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Like, I can say it out loud. I don't know what it is here from Canada, and I think. If the Conservatives or anybody were to just create that vision and not be scared, you're absolutely right. He goes on Rogan, brings the apple, and then also invites, because Rogan has said, he's like, I don't fucking go up to Canada anymore as that piece of shit Trudeau. Be like, hey, Joe, well, I'm going to personally invite you. You need to come up, do a show. I'll be there. Imagine that. That'll be a 2 million, 3 million view episode.
Yeah. It would change the political dynamic, but fear is the mind killer.
Yeah.
And but they're scared because O'Toole lost because they made a bonehead decision to say they were going to legalize assault rifles prior to the election. Like that election was pretty much in the bag, except somebody told him he didn't get one extra vote for that, right? And they should have just shut up about that, and he would have beat Trudeau back then. So I think that his party apparatchik are terrified of making another mistake like that.
Yeah.
And so, but it's not that they're not smart enough to know that it's different. There's a momentum now. People want the point you said about Canada that I think is really inspiring is there is something to Canada. And I don't know, you touched on it in the German thing, and I'll share this with you. They did a big study after World War II because they had all this data. And they studied World War II and they found the best tactical leaders by far were the Germans. They just outclassed everybody. Their generals, not the political ones, they were just spectacular. The best political support and movement, hands down, the British. Like the English would have died to a man, right? And Churchill. That movement was so strong that Hitler knew that he would never go on the island because he knew they would never surrender, like the French. Yeah. Sorry to say. The best logistical arm, hands down, was the U.S. They had kind of perfected Taylorism. They could move divisions faster than any country in the history of the world could ever do it. But the best soldiers, hands down, were the Canadians. And it's because we expanded and settled our country in a very difficult country, crossing the Canadian Shield, the prairies, rugged people who could deal with adversity, who could fall, who had ingenuity. And I'm just thinking when it comes to Canada, like, why wouldn't we build something that says, hey, look, we are tough but kind people. We can live with nature. We can support each other and have a few more safety nets than others because it's hard to survive a winter up here. It's easier to be an individual when you're living in the Midwest where you can survive in a homestead by yourself. Yeah. In Saskatoon, you need to cooperate, right? Yeah. So our politics is a little different, but we could say we are tough mofos who are kind to people, and we will welcome in your tough people, not your weak people, you know what I mean? Like let's build a characteristic and a culture of tough people who will give to others, but who will build things. But we don't have that right now. We're on a giant apology tour for everything that was amazing about Canada, bringing everybody in. So we have no identity. I don't really know what the future holds for us unless something big happens. And that's why I was so attracted to what Trump was doing, even though I don't like everything about him, is he is shaking shit up. Like he is going to change things with Elon and his team. Like they're going to eliminate half of the federal government. They're going to put money back into industry. I think America is going to boom like nothing. And Canada should be part of that.
I wholehearily agree. And I think that sentiment, it's like, just because there are things and elements of Trump and his movement that I like, it doesn't mean I'm an ideologue and an acolyte. Where this whole Trump derangement syndrome, I see it everywhere, and I kind of understand it because the first term I was freaked out, man, because I was told to freak out.
Yeah,
this guy is going to ruin democracy. I was like, oh shit, I like democracy. I fought for it, so I listened to every show. I consumed every podcast. I was like, yeah, this guy's got to go. This guy,
so did I.
And then the veil was lifted off my eyes once I started just listening to other opinions, and then realizing that, well, if this guy really was a spy for Russia, how come he's still in office? Oh wait, that wasn't true. Oh shit, that wasn't true. Okay, well, what else isn't true? And then just bit by bit, you realize there was a the machine was after him. And as much as I wouldn't trust him with a 10, I wouldn't trust him. Period. If I had a business to do with him, I wouldn't trust him. The people that are surrounding him clearly have had a political shift. That means something. He's basically surrounded, and I think he is essentially more of a liberal than any other Republican in history. Mm-hmm. Elon, Tulsi, Rogan, RFK,
liberals,
traditional liberals, hardcore liberal families are like, yeah, well, this guy's the only guy that's really kind of making sense. And I think that making sense and common sense is where we're going to find our truth, our way forward. And, to borrow a slogan from one of my favorite podcasts, PBD podcast. I don't know if you listen to Patrick David podcast. He uses "Future looks bright." And
Yeah.
he's basically my source of news now. If I want news, I go listen to him. I
Yeah.
like the way he delivers. He's to the point. We need to. I don't have one yet, but I'm an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist. And as bleak as things have looked, I think I echo your opinion too. Like when the American powerhouse like kicks off, it only makes sense for us who are like partners, neighbors, allies to get on board, regardless of who's in office, so that we mutually become better, more wealthy, more prosperous, and get rid of this idea that we need to like sacrifice our entire country at the altar of whether it's environmentalism or DEI or any other let's just make our entire country better and healthier. And from that point of view, I think we're finally turning the corner. So, I mean, that's where I hope, conversations like this can help people kind of get past the
Yeah.
ideological and get into kind of the more pragmatic and practical, right?
I think where you're really helpful too is we don't have to be just perpetually angry. You know what I mean? Like at one side or the other, because right, it gets in your head. It can ruin your business. It can ruin your life, right? Like I'm trying to encourage people to have good dialogues with people they disagree with, whether you're on the right or left. And it's not that rewarding because sometimes people don't want to hear it, but I'm just committed to, because there's good people, who want to learn. But like you said, if you're not exposed to it, like my lightning moment was when that North Carolina thing, the good people on both sides, and how badly that was misrepresented in the media.
Mm-hmm.
But when I first heard it, I'm like, yeah, the guy's a fucking white supremacist. He's saying what, but when you go and listen to the whole thing, you realize it's not what he was saying at all. He was saying some people just wanted to keep up statues because they were proud of their Confederate general heritage.
Yeah,
that's
and
all.
He clearly said, "I disavow the right wing, like not like he's clearly said it in his." I watched the whole thing. I was still kind of like, "Fuck that guy." But then when and what the other thing that really kind of shifted my perception was the trucker convoy, and we're kind of like 3 years out, right, from a trucker convoy. That was the big light switch that went off because I was literally on the ground seeing I was like, wow, this is a party. This is insane. Like I've never seen this in my life. This is pure Canadian patriotism. And Quebec separatists hanging out with Alberta separatists. I was like, that's going to be bad. But either way, it was just an expression of joy, essentially, that we hadn't had in years. And so I go home. I'm like, oh man, let's watch the news. It's going to be awesome. And then they're like these disgusting fringe minorities desecrating Terry Fox's statue. I'm like, I was standing on it. What do you mean desecrating it? Like, how did that happen? That's not what happened. And then I realized, oh, this is the way that they manipulate and control. Like we were high-fiving cops, we were handing out coffees, we were cleaning up the streets, but the media was able to really capture those that weren't there, that already had a bias, and really cement their belief system. And then I realized, okay, this is just a really big game. And so I think we're starting to slowly get out of that. And I hope more people like just start to realize that. You said on the last podcast, go live your life, go enjoy it. And you're not going to change what Trudeau does because that's just not going to happen. And don't get manipulated and don't get used. And that was, advice that I really took to heart because it's really easy to kind of get wrapped up in the negative and to just be like, fuck you all the time. And, angry tweet. But ultimately, if you turn Twitter off, you turn the news off, you won't know about tariffs. You won't know about what's going on in the States. Yeah. You'll just live, like in my case, like a blissful 20-year-old life where you go hang out with your friends, you go to school, you go to work, and like the rest of the world is not important to you. And we can still do that day to day.
But the algorithms want everybody angry.
Of course.
Right. And so it just drives people farther and farther apart from each other. But it doesn't give absolution to people from doing the right thing in hindsight. And I think, this is speaking to your point is I would like, if I was Pierre, I would say, if I get elected as prime minister, I will offer all the veterans who were kicked out because of the vaccine back in, because you know what I mean? Like there's certain things we could do to help build some bridges back, but everybody is terrified of doing anything bold. And Canada just seems destined to be boring and apologetic at the moment. Like, Pierre, I want him to be inspirational. I hope he goes on Rogan and kicks ass. He would completely kick ass. But it goes back to your trucker convoy point. I find the Conservatives often don't have the best advisors because they only want people from within. And I know some of Trudeau's Liberals advisors, and some of those guys are hardcore Conservatives. They're just for sale mercenaries, right?
Right.
But like they're just. But
Hussars.
when the trucker convoy raised that money, they should have offered $250,000 to Trudeau's top media advisor and brought him over. Instead, they had kind of local, nice grassroots people, and lawyers who are like on the far, but it's not the top, right? And so, how do we win? And so, I'm not sure Pierre. He's kind of insulated right now. I'm not sure he's going outside of his circle to get high end advice on how to kick ass and become a legend.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that. So let's wrap things up with in your ideal world. Okay, what happens over the next, let's say, 5 years to the country, and like specifically with, like, let's say the CAF. What you already mentioned, seeing those troops, like there's 330 in a loss. I think there was 400, 500 that were released or kicked out of the CAF. We started there. What else would you like to see in the next 5 years or so?
Oh, in the CAF, I don't know. Like I tell people, it's not a bad time to join the CAF now because recruiting is low. You can get promoted fast. Like for young people who are looking for something, I think it's a path to get a house, possibly if you can sit. And I advised the CAF to offer kind of a plan to help young people buy a house. Like that would be a way to do. That'd be a good way to do recruiting because young people can't buy a house. So it's like, give me 6 years and we'll give you a down payment, interest, whatever. I just think there's a catastrophe on the horizon. Like the corruption and the mind virus in the highest headquarters of the CAF right now is bad. Like I have no idea. But like joining the military and doing good stuff would be fun. But I don't know if Pierre has enough to kind of unite a country from like Newfoundland to British Columbia right now with how much division there is. And if you're going to do that, you have to be bold. It's not just saying the kind of same boring things and then you're going to take power and change it. Because there's too many strong, when you look at how many people went after Trump, there are those powers in Canada looking to attack whoever comes into power. And you can't beat them unless you have a momentum, unless you have a passionate campaign promise. And I'm not seeing it at the moment, but I don't know when Canada deploys next, honestly, somewhere. I think it'll have to come up to the next deployment, and then that might shake stuff up. But I fear the Canadian Forces is almost beyond fixing at some level right now without something drastic.
Yeah. So do you think Iraqi Jenny Carignan survives a leadership change? Do you think she survives the changeover from the?
Oh no, she's gone right away. What I'd like to see if the Conservatives is bring somebody back who stood up. I'm not saying it's Whalen, but at least he stood up to them at great personal cost. But or Mike Rouleau, bring somebody back who's a warfighter. But let the troops know that there's a warfighter in charge there, and that we're going to raise standards again, kick ass, not apologize for being tough mofos, and get some pride back in there. But I don't see she survives if the Conservatives are there because that's just a giant mess. And I can't even imagine trying to sort that out, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I only can go so deep into that conversation before especially because I have so many friends that are still in. And my friends are all senior officers, senior NCOs, right?
Yeah.
And it's so hard to hear them talk about the institution that we all loved at one point because we were all kids when we joined. Right. We're all idealistic, just like we're joining the best organization in the world. We all became quote unquote men during that process. So when you hear just the lack of inspiring words that are coming out of that institution from the folks that really, in my opinion, are like the best war fighters we have. Shit, man.
To me, it's time for one of them to stand up. Like, how there's like key times. Like, I think if somebody stood up and said something inspirational, they would be selected for the next government. But, General Whalen's got probably 1,000 messages from different officers saying, hey, I support you, but I can't say anything. Yeah. And, nobody can say that our policy in the Canadian Armed Forces is encouraging allegations and undermining due process. Like we should just say that. We need to look at this again. We need to make sure that people, but why can't somebody just say that? Who's a general?
We have a perfect example, again, in the United States with, Lieutenant Colonel Stu Scheller, who came out and said, you generals that fuck this whole Afghan withdrawal up need to be held accountable. He got thrown in the brig. He lost his family. Like, that's the type of courage and leadership we need. And I personally know him. He's been on the show. He is now the senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, because he stood up for what he believed. Like that. That's biblical shit, right? You stand up for what you believe in, because at the end, it's, if you want to say God rewards you, it's true. The universe rewards you for sticking to your guns and your principles and acting virtuously. And he knew he was going to get hammered. Obviously, he was in uniform on a YouTube video saying, this is wrong. He got smoked. But at the end of the day, now he's at one of the highest positions in the planet, because he believed in what he had to say and he knew that he was right. So you're right. We need somebody like that to come out and just, hold people to account. Maybe it's not even in uniform. Like you said, maybe it's just one of the former generals, but at least somebody, make a call to action that we can rally around from the warfighter community. Cause that's what's happening in the United States, the warfighter community, because there's that reverence and respect for 20 years of warfighting. And in my opinion, it was for, treasure that was essentially ill-gotten, whatever you like. My perspective is like, we were at war for profit for companies. It wasn't as virtuous as I would have liked to have thought it was. So now it's like, okay, now it's time for us to come back and kind of have our say, because we did your dirty work. Now it's our time at the table. But I don't see many Canadians, and like, obviously I'm being hypocritical here. I'm not throwing in my hat into the political spectrum anytime soon, or political ring anytime soon. But it would be nice to see some more Canadian veterans that have something to say step up and get involved. So be curious to see what happens in the next 5 years anyways.
My favorite quote from Jerry Maguire, from Kinko Jesus, the copier Jesus there. I don't know if you've watched Jerry Maguire, but
it's been a while.
But when he's printing off his manifesto to improve the industry, and the guy at the copy shop is giving him his manifesto, and he looks like Jesus, he goes, that's the path to greatness, man. You got to hang your balls out there. Right? I live by that quote.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to wrap this up. That's the perfect place. You got to hang your balls out there. Absolutely. You know what? We're talking about, we need a tagline that's comparable to Future Looks Bright. You got to hang your balls out there. That's it. Merch is coming. Hats are coming, folks. Vote for it.
I'll buy it. I'll be your first order of that.
Oh, God. That's how movements are created. There we go. Phil, thanks so much, man. It's always a hoot talking to you. I mean, we should do this probably more often than every year and a half. You got a lot of good things to say. And obviously the case with Whalen coming up, and just that whole kind of gong show from my perspective is going to be really important, I hope, for a lot of Canadians. So definitely stay tuned for that if you're tuning in. And Phil, do you have any last words before we wrap up today?
No, just keep fighting the good fight, brother. You're doing good work out there, and I appreciate you. Right on. I appreciate it. So folks, go do what you got to do, like, subscribe, and make sure to hit the bell notification. Rogue Lawyer on Instagram and LinkedIn if you want to follow me. Right on. Yeah. And those links will be in the description as per usual. So go enjoy the rest of the day, folks. The future looks bright. Hang your balls out there and train hard, fight easy. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.